So today we're going to be covering Edexcel, Buddhism, A-level, and we're going to be doing some revision. And I don't think there's a better place to really start than the political, cultural, environmental, and social factors, which all affected the Buddha, his teachings, the impact of his teachings, the significance of his teachings, and how it developed sects of Buddhism and all these things. I think we're going to mainly focus on Karen Armstrong's area, and more or less the what was surrounding Buddhism and the Buddha around the time he was starting to propagate his beliefs. So I think if we just start with the Buddha in the middle, Buddha and India at the time, we have to remember that the beginning of where most of this started was the Indus Valley civilization. So if we just talk about the Indus Valley civilization, and the importance of the Indus Valley civilization was the invasion, which came not so long after the Indus Valley civilization, which was the Aryan invaders. And a lot of you guys might know what the Aryan invaders are, or the Aryan invaders to be precise, as it really was the beginning of, let's just say, the caste system and the Aryan race and many of these factors. But with it, they brought a number of things. So if we talk about the Aryan invaders, which is a very important part of the early development of India, which ultimately affected Buddhism as we know it today. So this was about 2800 BCE. So this is very early on. I think it was even like 3500 to 2800, where the Aryan invaders came in, and what they brought with them was the Upanishads, which is a very important philosophical text for Hindus, and the Indus scriptures. And the Upanishads is kind of where we start to see the formation of things like the caste system. So, yep, that's very important. And more specifically, was the Brahmins. And the Brahmins are going to be a pretty big talking point in the kind of revision session we're doing today. And there are going to be lots of links, which we link back to Upanishads, but here as well, we can make a big link to Hinduism. Hinduism is going to be another big factor here. When we're talking about the early political impacts of India surrounding the time and what that had on the Buddha. So I think that's a great part to a great place to start. Sorry, and if we were to ever have an 8 marker, which is just analyze the historical significance of let's just say the Indus Valley civilization, I don't think it will be this specific on the teachings of the Buddha. There are already a number of things we can start to pick apart. For instance, the Indus Valley civilization. We're talking about 3500 CE. Was then invaded by the Aryan invaders. Right here, which is the Aryan invaders. It was around 3000 to 2700 BCE, which they brought with them the Upanishads. So you can talk about this, get some AO1 marks. But the importance here is the Upanishads, which is the philosophical text foundation of Hinduism, which has key teachings such as the caste system, and we started to see Brahmins, where religious practices became really important, specifically the Brahmins. And by the way, guys, my handwriting is terrible, so do keep that in mind. I guess listen more to my words. But that's really important. And from the Upanishads, we can start to unpack a number of central teachings that Hindus believe. So if we just draw an arrow down here, we can talk about things like samsara, which is rebirth, right? That's very important for Hindus. And this will all link back to Buddha at the time. So we've got samsara, rebirth. We also have things like karma, which started to come as a result of this. Brahmins, that's very important to talk about. I'm going to put Aryans with a question mark because we're going to refer back to the impact of the Aryans with a more detailed look. But that's very important as well. We also have things again, the 5 precepts. This, the precepts isn't an original Buddhist concept. The precepts were something which was existing within Hinduism before the Buddha. So it's important to mention these things. Also, the truth about reality in the sense of gods. Yep, those gods within Hinduism, which all of these bullet points here we're going to come back to and unpack them a bit more. So the importance of gods, or gods in plural. We can just pick which is rebirth. Yep. Even teachings such as Dharma function or anicca, so impermanence. A lot of this was taken from Hinduism. I say taken. It was developed by the Upanishads, which had higher teachings such as this. By the way, they do believe in a form of soul, which is a very important thing to remember as well. So this is all that we've managed to unpack just from the Aryan invaders, which led to the Upanishads. And I guess the most important one here is the caste system, which came as a result of this. And we're going to talk about the caste system right now, because this is very key, I think. One of the most important parts you would want to talk about if we were to ever get like a question which pertains to the importance of the historical context or the political context of the Buddha and how this impacted his teachings, is the Hindu caste system. So if we just draw like a little arrow, like a little pyramid, if I can even do it properly, and just make a good representation. I'm sure you guys know this anyway. Yep, there we go. It's a bit of a sketchy pyramid, but there's 4 systems really to the Hindu caste system. So there's like this, and it's this. So you have like the peasants, and then here you have like the farmers, then here you have the kshatriyas or warriors, and then here you have the priests. And if you want to know like their technical names, is Brahmins here. You have the kshatriyas. And I don't know the farmers or peasants, nor do you need to know them. And then underneath all this, importantly, there is a group called the Untouchables. Mind my arrow. And the Untouchables are not even able to get into this kind of system. And this system is a hierarchical system. So the Brahmins are on top of the Kshatriyas, who are on top of the farmers, who are on top of the peasants. These warriors are always going to be inferior to the Brahmins. But what happened during the Buddhist time, so if we just go with the Buddha and during his time here, so Buddha, was there were starting to be clashes between the Brahmins versus Kshatriyas, so the warriors. So there was the priests and the warriors who were, there was a lot of tension there. And this is because there was a lot of accumulation of wealth. We'll just put wealth. Brahmins and Kshatriyas, or the warriors, would hold glorious palaces, and they would have kingdoms, so we can just put like palaces, kingdoms, extreme wealth, which these other groups wouldn't really have. And this also links to samsara, by the way. So we'll talk about that in a minute, but we're just going to keep talking about this. So they would have wealth, and there was a lot of greed here. So there would be lots of fights between the Brahmins and the Kshatriyas during the Buddha's time because of the accumulation of wealth and the caste system and how it's formed. And this is important to note because wealth is something the Buddha didn't really talk highly of, nor greed. Palaces, greed, and also you can mention how the Buddha was raised in a palace. So that's also quite a good point to kind of remember. Buddha raised in palace himself. But now we're going to look into the significance of this, because we've been talking more about the context at the time. But the significance is that wealth, the Buddha, we need to remember one of the teachings, which is right livelihood. Livelihood. Okay, mind my spelling. But yeah, right livelihood, which is the idea that there is a correct way to make money, a correct way to hold wealth, right? Correct way for money. And that's not by exploiting others, no exploitation, nor cause harm to others, nor even environmental damage, which challenges the caste system, which this directly challenges the caste system, because the Brahmins have power over the Kshatriyas, so they're exploiting the Kshatriyas. The Kshatriyas are exploiting the farmers, and the farmers are exploiting the peasants. This is not right livelihood. So you can kind of see how this very important teaching, which by the way links to the Eightfold Path, has developed from the Hindu caste system. Because the Eightfold Path, this is one of the Eightfold Path. This is one of the eight. This is one of the eight principles or the morals you have to follow. And to be more specific, right livelihood is a part of right action, which is morality, which is sila. So there's three higher teachings in the Eightfold Path. There's panna, which is morality. There's sila, which is wisdom. And then there's samadhi, which is meditation. So this came a part of morality. So the Buddha's morality challenged the Hindu caste system of right livelihood. But also greed, a lot of you guys are probably thinking about, links to the three poisons, which the Buddha described in one of his Four Noble Truths, specifically the third Noble Truth, as being that which fuels the fire of suffering. So it's basically what keeps you in a perpetual state of existence, or perpetual state of permanence, so to say. So that's his famous quote. Fire for the fuel is what greed is. That's the Buddha's quote. As coal, fires the furnace, or keeps the furnace alive, greed is what keeps us in impermanence. So fire for the fuel, which is greed. And one of the Noble Truths, the Noble Truth, the possibility of cessation of suffering, is to be rid of greed, or the three poison. So that's very important to remember, because you can link just that one aspect here with the greed and the palaces, to the three poisons, which can then link to the Four Noble Truths, more specifically the third Noble Truth, which is the cessation of suffering, or the possibility of cessation of suffering, to be more precise. And that's just from one aspect there, with the greed. But then you can also talk about, if you want to get really clever with it, is kshatriyas within themselves. So you can start to highlight specific things. So if we just talk about warriors, we'll just put warriors here. And warriors in Hinduism and the caste system, these were highly ordained, so very prestigious. Very prestigious, right here. So being a warrior was seen as like a very good role. You're like almost a pinnacle of society, and was highly praised. But more later on into the course as well, we're going to start learning about ahimsa, which is to do no harm. Do no harm. And a thing that we cover in Edexcel is Yoga Sita and the Warrior. So if we just put here, Yoga Sita and the Warrior, is a extract which is based around a warrior who asked the Buddha on the efficacy of being a warrior. Is it something which is blessed? And the Buddha very clearly admonishes him and says, like, to be a warrior is to cause continuous suffering. So the Buddha is like denouncing kshatriyas, quite explicitly, which is very important in teachings of the development of teachings of ahimsa, which again, for those is a moral precept here, which is very important to remember. Of the five, which did develop from Hinduism, so you could also argue that did develop from Hinduism, and we're going to get into a question and we're going to explore those things in a bit, but yeah, that's that. And then we're going to link something to ahimsa right now, which some of you guys might be shouting, is Jainism. We need to remember that during the time of the Buddha, and this is really we're gonna really talk about the social aspect of India at the time of the Buddha. Jainism was starting to become more prominent. was founded and started to gain prominence. Was gaining influence. And I think this is very important to note, because right now we're talking about the caste system, and there's some unrest, very important to mention unrest here, with the caste system, with the clashes between the Brahmins and the priests, the Brahmins and the Kshatriyas, sorry. But around the Buddhist time, we're seeing a shift away from this kind of caste system, more to exploring other options to kind of achieve enlightenment. Because, again, be careful, or remember, guys, that enlightenment isn't a unique teaching to Buddhism. Enlightenment is something which is found in Hinduism as well. So here we can just go and add enlightenment here. We're starting to see a shift away from this notion of the hierarchies, more to exploring lots of other options. So if we write about the other things that were surrounding the Buddha during his time, the other things, we'll just write the other things. There was the Saramanas, which were the forest dwellers, Saramanas, or forest dwellers, who were the extreme ascetics. And what are the extreme ascetics? These were the people, you might remember in the Buddha story, there was 5 of them, who would deprive themselves of food, water, drink, and basically believed that this was the road to enlightenment. Extreme ascetics, or wandering holy men, if you want to not say Saramanas. Extreme ascetics, right? Who would deprive themselves of food and believed this was the path to enlightenment. There was also folk traditions at the time. There was lots of beliefs in spirits, and how that would help them, achieve enlightenment, worshipping spirits. Ghost stories, things like that. There was lots of superstitions with the folk traditions. We also saw the wandering holy men. I put this different to Saramanas because they are a bit different. Wandering holy men. We had the yogis, who would often do yoga naked. So yoga, naked. We have, I think it's important, we're not going to go into Alara Kalama and all that in this video, but you can maybe put reference into them. So we're starting to see, we've also got Jainism. So the point of this is we're starting to see a shift away from the traditional caste system. So we're going away from, so I'll put an X here. So we're going away from the caste system, and we're starting to explore other options into how to get enlightenment, right? And this is where Jainism comes. Jainism believes in no harm, i.e. ahimsa, no harm, ahimsa, but also believes that compassion is extremely important. So you're probably thinking there's more Buddhist teachings here. Compassion. We can put karuna in brackets. For a Buddhist teaching. So this was starting to become, we're starting to see a shift in the values as well. So again, there's so many teachings we can just nick from other faiths, so to say, which is Jainism right now. With karuna, compassion, you can maybe make a link to Mahayana Buddhism. I wouldn't really go down that route, but this is important as you can mention, which is something we'll talk about later on in the course, the Buddha did approve of Jainism. For instance, approved by the Buddha, with a little tick. And we know this because in the Kalama Sutta, sorry for my spelling, the Buddha allowed a disciple Upeya, very important name to remember, and I'll just put it in brackets so we remember how to spell it properly. Upeya, so like that, so it's Upaya, to continue to be a Jain, but also follow the Buddha's teachings. So that's a pretty important part to remember, continues to be Jain. So we'll write that. So he definitely approved of Jainism, and that can link to a huge amount of things in terms of debates within Buddhism, such as plurality, but we're not going to go there. But that's very important to remember. So the underlying premise of all this, it's good to mention, okay, yeah, there's Saramanas, there's wandering spirits, holy men, there's lots of superstitions around the time, Jainism, but you need to understand what's the underlying preface of all this. What's the point? Like, the exam board of Edexcel, they don't just want you to list, okay, the Buddha got ahimsa from Jainism, okay, the Buddha rejected superstitions because of, there wasn't any evidence, which is a link to the folk traditions around the time, right? It's good, it's all well and good to like mention these things, but to get to the kind of A-star level, you really want to highlight how a lot of this was in rejection to the caste system here. We're starting to see a social shift, right, from the political aspect of the caste system. The idea that some people are better than others on virtue of their samsaric rebirth and what position they're reborn into, right? This is why all of these things are starting to become increasingly popular when the Buddha was starting to grow up, right? Is in rejection to this. So you really want to highlight that in an essay, and I'll kind of show you how we're going to do that in like a bit later. But that's probably like the most important part here to kind of mention. And to kind of further this point, we're going to talk about a key Buddhist teaching, which is called Mappo. And if you mention this is really high level stuff. Like, this is what the examiners are going to be like really impressive. Like, this is where you're hitting the B to A star territory. That there is a degeneration of teachings. This is the concept of Mappo, which you might have remembered from Theravada Buddhism. Not Theravada Buddhism, sorry. Is it Triratna? It's not Triratna. Pure Land Buddhism, my bad. Degeneration of teachings. And this is the idea that every so often the teachings become lost, too complex, or to a point where we need a purification of the core teachings of Buddhism, i.e. the Dharma. And this links to a very important thing, which I think is very easy to oversee. That's Jatakas. And that's the fables and stories before the Buddha. So Siddhartha, as we remember, is not the first ever Buddha. Our Buddha is not the first ever Buddha. There are many Buddhas before Siddhartha Gautama who would have taught the exact same thing of the Four Noble Truths, karma, samsara, all of these things. But these teachings have been lost due to the caste system, the Indus Valley civilization, the degeneration of the teachings and how society is shifting. And we're starting to see a shift away from the political aspects, i.e. the caste system. And now we're exploring these kind of things like Jainism, extreme aestheticism, spirits, praying to God, these things. Because there's a rejection of this, yet this was a perfect time for the Buddha to be born, because there is a degeneration of teachings, and we know that the Buddha is, going to teach the purified Dharma, so you can mention the Dharma here. But the reason why this is so important is because in an essay or a 20 marker where it's basically analysing the significance of this, you're probably going to mention, well, the Buddha, he got ahimsa from Jainism. The Buddha got, the 5 precepts, samsara and enlightenment from the Upanishads, which came from the Aryan invaders. So your whole argument is just going to be like, you're going to be like, yeah, it is very significant, but you're probably going to make a very big paragraph on how the Buddha got a lot of his ideas from the political aspects and all of these different things, which was happening in the region during the Buddha's time. But I think the most important part to remember is that the Buddha never claimed to be a revolutionary, i.e. these teachings were new. There were previous Buddhas before Siddhartha, which is very true. Like, this is one of the earliest teachings we know from Buddhism. And that the Buddha was more or less, as Damien Keown will mention, so we're starting to get into scholars now. Scholars. Damien and Karen Armstrong, so you can mention both of these people. Damien Keown and Armstrong call the Buddha a social reformer. And this would be such a good thing to mention in an essay. If you argue the Buddha's teachings weren't unique, but they were necessary to reform the societal standards of Buddhism at the time. Buddha was a social reformer. And your argument, which I think is really pushing the A-star, like, this is like beyond the A-star. Not to sound sanctimonious or anything, but this would be a really nice question now that we unpack it, looking into the impacts of the political environment of the Buddha, is mentioning that actually the Buddha, you can mention, actually, Buddha stole a lot of his teachings, or, Buddha got a lot of his teachings from other faiths at the time. However, the very important part to remember is that the Buddha never claimed to be unique. Never claimed to be unique. And that he is simply fulfilling his goal as a Buddha, which is to purify the Dharma. It's to set the Dharma in motion, which is referring to his first sermon, setting Dharma in motion. These teachings exist, but they have been lost. Teachings have been lost. Therefore, the Buddha was needed as a very paramount social reformer. And this is where we can start to unpack key teachings such as the Middle Way, Nibbana, and we can make reference to the Eightfold, some of the most paramount, important teachings that Buddhism holds. This is all unpacking and all basically links on the Aryan race. And there was another few things I wanted to touch upon. So we could talk about here the universality of the Dharma. This was very key to the Buddha of Dharma. And this is kind of seen with imagery. If you know about the stupas, which you will explore later on anyway, once we get into imagery, I'll make a revision video on that. There are 4 gateways within a stupa. Or within its dome. And this is a symbolic representation that the Dharma was meant for everyone. Dharma, everyone. It wasn't unique to a select few like the Brahmins. So we're talking about the Brahmins here. Everyone, right? It wasn't meant for a select few. It was literally meant for everybody. So even the untouchables. There wasn't this hierarchical system as there is in the caste system. So there's an outright rejection of that. And it's also very important to remember that the Buddha, you can link it to, teachings of anti-war. The Buddha seemed to be very anti-war. But we're going to talk about also the idea, which is basically a Theravada idea, of self-reliance. And Karen Armstrong mentions this a lot in the extract. We'll look at an extract element of this, how people would kind of move towards things like folk traditions, worshipping spirits and believing in them, having, lots of faith in God in hopes of enlightenment. And the Buddha kind of outright rejects a lot of these traditions, superstitions. In fact, he outright rejects them. He doesn't believe in the concept of soul because there is little evidence. But this is because he believed very much in the idea of self-reliance. It's us who achieves enlightenment. Us, not external things, which is very Theravadian. And we'll get into this in probably my next revision. We're going to look at Theravada Buddhism, its distinctive teachings, the scholars associated with it, etc. But this is a pretty key teaching of the Buddha, which is also moving away from a societal shift from Hinduism and the gods, reliance on things like Vishnu and other gods, to now relying on yourself and you yourself employing skillful means. So we're going to talk about Kusula and Akasula, which is skillful and unskillful means, which is merit, karma. Merit-karma. And yeah, that's, there's, so, yeah, we can talk about this and we can link it from this, how many of these teachings came around, self-reliance and, key teachings, because if we want to just be hyper-specific here, Saramanans rejected by the Middle Way. Folk traditions, the Buddha rejected any external reliance. So you could talk about the folk traditions were significant in the idea of external reliance. and chanting and all those stuff, and the Buddha outright rejected that and believed in self-reliance. Wandering holy men, this was similar to the Saramanas, the extreme ascetics, yogis. Enlightenment wasn't based on just practicing meditation. It was a bit more than that, and that's why there is the three higher teachings of samadhi, samadhi being meditation, morality, and wisdom. That meditation isn't just enough to essentially become awakened. There is also wisdom and morality which is needed. So we touched upon a bit of morality with right livelihood. You can really unpack these a lot further. You could argue a lot of wisdom came from the yogis and how this wasn't enough to achieve enlightenment. Jainism, we got ahimsa, but Jainism is probably the only one which the Buddha kind of accepts in terms of being compatible with Buddhism, as seen with Opeya. We mentioned Opeya continues to be a Buddhist. But I think the biggest importance is like linking it back to the caste system, how this all originated from the Aryan invaders, and making the argument that the Buddha took a lot of his ideas from the culture around the time, maybe adapting it, being a social reformer. But you could argue that the reason why the Buddha adapted the teachings, because these teachings were familiar to people. He didn't want it to be alien, but he was simply showing them the way to do it. And this is, again, another Theravadian aspect here, that the historical Buddha only wanted us to he showed us the way to get enlightenment, i.e. the Eightfold Path. And this is why many of the teachings are familiar. But then you're going to reject the idea that he's just simply, maybe just, you could say, stealing from many of these faiths their ideas, by arguing that actually many of these ideas have been taught by previous Buddhas, and that the Buddha is simply, because of Mapo, it's just, re-talking about these ideas again. So to kind of look at a question here, so if we just go to my Google Docs, and I just kind of want to show you a question of what it would look like. I'm yet to finish this 20 marker, but I think it's very good to show. Sorry. If we just look at it, I'm pretty sure it's here. Maybe I didn't have the question. So a question of this nature would be, analyze the significance of the social, environmental, political, and cultural aspects of India at the time on the impact of the Buddhist teachings. I think there's a plethora of things to talk about here. Like, there is just so much to talk about. We unpacked all of this in half an hour, and we've managed to get like an A to an